Hello, everybody. Today, me and Ari are going to talk a bit about censorship and artistic control in the Soviet Union, or Soviet cinema, sorry. We're going to go into how Soviet directors had to work in a system where the state had a lot of control over what could actually be shown on screen. So, today we'll be looking at what censorship looked like, why certain films were targeted, and how directors tried to work around those limitations. So let's start. So here's a table of contents, roughly showing what's, um, you know, what the slides contain. So we have, an introduction. For then we'll move on to cinema and power, censorship, historical context. We'll look into some case studies, some directors and some movies, and how those directors kind of adapted to the limitations in the Soviet Union, and we'll end off with a conclusion. Um, all right, so to start, I think it is important to understand that in the Soviet Union, cinema was never seen as just merely entertainment. Film was treated as something more powerful than that. It was seen as something that could, reach a huge audience, especially people who may not be able to read, or, they don't read that much about politics. So one of the reasons the government cared, so that's one of the reasons like the government cared so much about it. Film could shape the way people thought about history, society, war, and even their place within the state. So because of that, cinema was taken very seriously, and it was like regulated very closely. So directors were not working in normal, film conditions. They were working in a system where studios, scripts, and the release of their films were all tied to state institutions. So that meant, artistic freedom was always limited to some extent, even like for major directors in the Soviet Union. And that is part of why Soviet film history is so, interesting to me, I think, because some of the most important filmmakers, of the 20th century were created under those kinds of, conditions. So, all right, one main reason Soviet cinema was so tightly controlled is, I think, pretty simple. Film, reaches people reaches people fast, and it reaches a lot of them. Unlike maybe a novel, which might only reach, a certain population of readers, but film could reach, like mass audiences very quickly. So from the state's point of view, cinema was too important to leave unsupervised. It could shape how people understood, war, revolution, even like Soviet national identity. So there was a lot more, there was a political side to this as well. In the Soviet Union, art was not supposed to be neutral. The government believed culture should help build socialism and support the system. So film was expected to do something useful socially and ideologically, not just exist as personal artistic expression. So by the 1930s, especially under Stalin, this became much stricter. Art was expected to be clear, optimistic, politically understandable. So in film, that usually meant stories with clear messages and, characters that, reflected approved values. Also, like, they wanted kind of controlled historical narratives. So censorship was not really some outside force acting on cinema per se, you know, it was built into the system filmmakers were working in. So one thing that is easy to misunderstand is that censorship did not always mean a film was just fully banned and it just disappeared. No, sometimes that did happen, but often it worked in quieter ways. A film could be delayed for years. Maybe, certain scenes might be removed from the movie. Distribution could be restricted. Um, Production could be stopped before the movie was even finished. Even sometimes if a film was completed, like they'd finish the movie, but then it would be shelved and it wouldn't be shown to the public. So censorship could happen at pretty much any stage. It could affect a film before production, during it, or if, as I said, even after the film was done. And honestly, that is part of what makes it so powerful. It was not always one dramatic decision. Sometimes it was slow pressure, like there were like a lot of delays and there was a lot of interference. So from a director's point of view, that could that could be just as destructive, because if your film is barely seen, it almost doesn't matter that it technically existed. All right, so kind of to make sense of that, it helps to know what Soviet officials generally wanted from cinema. In general, they preferred films that were politically clear, that was socially useful. They wanted it to be like historically controlled, and they wanted it to be optimistic, and the ideal film for them was supposed to be understandable and purposeful. It was supposed to guide the audience, not leave them confused or uncertain. That is why films that were very symbolic. They were like emotionally heavy, um, or like was that was very open to interpretation. It was very suspicious, and they didn't really want films like that out there. So if a film gave the audience too much room to think for themselves, that could already be seen as a problem. So one of the main tensions in Soviet film history is that officials generally wanted clarity, while many important directors were much more interested in symbolism, ambiguity, and emotional complexity in their stories and in their characters. So now we're gonna kind of move on into more case studies. So kind of looking into different movies and their directors, and how their movies were restricted or maybe not even released. So the first director we want to look at is Sergei Eisenstein. He was already one of the most famous Soviet filmmakers, because of his very famous film, Battleship Potemkin, which is what makes his later problems especially interesting. Even with, the reputation that he had with that, like, Battleship Potemkin, he was not protected from censorship. His film, Bayesian Meadow, was stopped before it was completed, and it was condemned in 1937. What is interesting here is that the issue was not just the topic of the film. Eisenstein had a very intense like the movie had a very intense and highly stylized visual approach. He used montage, symbolism, and emotionally charged imagery. But in the 1930s, especially during like the Stalin period, that kind of complexity was becoming more kind of scrutinized. So officials increasingly wanted films that were a lot more simpler and easier to align with official ideology. So Beijing Meadow, it gives a good example of how censorship could be aimed not just at what a film said, but also how it is said. Style itself could be treated as politically unreliable, let's just say. All right, now we'll move on to Ali.
The second case is Andrei Tarkovsky, and honestly, this is one of the clearest examples of Soviet censorship affecting a major film. Andrei Rublev was finished in 1966, but it didn't just come out normally. It had cuts, delays, and very limited release in the Soviet Union. Even though Tarkovsky later became really respected internationally, his relationship with Soviet authorities was always kind of tense. The film is set in medieval Russia and follows this painter, Andrei Rublev. But it's not just about his life, it goes way deeper than that. It talks about things like art, suffering, violence, faith, silence, and what it means to create something in a harsh world. And that's exactly why it was a problem for the government uh, to not be released without restrictions. It was openly criticizing them, or it wasn't openly criticizing them or anything, but it was too deep, too spiritual, and honestly kind of complicated. It didn't give one clear message or answer, and that didn't fit with what Soviet cinema was supposed to be. So what's important about this film is that it shows censorship was not only about stopping direct political criticism. Even a film like this, which is more about human experience and spirituality, could still be seen as dangerous if it went beyond what ideology could explain or control. The third case is Alexander Oskaldov's Commissar. It was made in 1967, but then it got shelved for almost 20 years, which already showed how serious this censorship was. The film is really important because it shows how censorship didn't just affect the film itself, but also the director's whole career. The story is set during the Civil War, but instead of showing the revolution in a heroic or glorified way, it focuses more on motherhood, vulnerability, Jewish family life, and that was what made it very difficult and different from what the Soviet state usually wanted. Normally, they preferred films that showed history in a clear, controlled, and political way. But this film made history feel more personal and emotional, and honestly more complicated. Because of this, the film was suppressed and Oskaldov's career was heavily damaged. So this case shows that censorship wasn't just about controlling what people see, it could actually affect a director's entire future. The last case that we want to look at is Elem Klimov's Agony. This film was made in the 1970s, but it wasn't actually released in the Soviet Union until 1985, which is 15 years later, which already tells you that there were serious issues with this film. The film focuses on Rasputin and the collapse of Imperial Russia. On the surface, that might seem like a safe topic since it was about the fall of the Tsarist regime, not the Soviet Union. But the problem is in how Klimov present the history and the film. The film is very intense, chaotic, visually overwhelming, and instead of making history look organized or controlled, it shows power as unstable and decaying and kind of irrational. And that was probably why it caused problem for this film. Even though it is set in the past, the way it shows corruption and collapse could still feel uncomfortable or even relatable to the Soviet Union and the Soviet government. So this case shows that censorship didn't just exist under Stalin, it continued in later periods too, even if it worked in a slightly different ways. So how did directors respond to all of these? A big part of the answer is that they became indirect. If they could not talk openly about something, they might use historical settings, symbolism, poetic imagery, visual metaphor, uh, or other ways that they could use. They found ways of saying things without saying them too directly. And that is one reason so many important Soviet films feels layered and rich and complicated to understand. They were often made under pressure, so directors had to communicate. in a more coded or suggestive ways. This is actually one of the most interesting things about Soviet cinema. Censorship clearly limited artistic freedom, but it helped uh, that filmmakers use inventive ways and forms of expression. So censorship shaped not only what could be shown, but also the artistic language that filmmakers had was developed. But why studying this censorship is important? Studying this censorship is important because in Soviet cinema, studying censorship in Soviet cinema helps us explain why Soviet film looks the way it does. It helps explain why certain films were delayed or suppressed and why directors often lean so heavily on symbolism and metaphor, and why so many Soviet films feel visually beautiful but also emotionally heavy or difficult to understand. It also gives it also gives us a better understanding of Soviet culture. Censorship tells us something about what officials wanted art to do and what they were afraid art might do, and how artists kept trying to work within or around those limits with using the ways that we mentioned. So this topic is not just about banned films. It is really about the relationship between art, power, and control. So to wrap up, censorship played a huge role in shaping Soviet cinema. It affected not only which films people were allowed to see, but also how directors approached storytelling. Looking at all of these films, that it shows us that censorship could take a lot of forms. It could stop a film, delay it, or cut it, or restrict it in release, or damage the career of the director that making this film. At the same time, it also pushed many filmmakers toward a very creative and inventive ways of working, especially through symbolism, allegory, and ambiguity. So, in the end, Soviet cinema matters not only because what it was prevented from saying, but also because of remarkable artistic language directors developed under those pressures. And thank you for listening to us. And here is the references that we used for this presentation.